Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. I'm TCaptainX. Today we're going to be discussing the long-range meta in MW3 Warzone Season 1, comparing and contrasting some of these different weapons and loadouts, and then of course at the end we'll be showing my recommended class setups for all of these. So to make things easier for you guys to kind of understand and see visually, we have an Excel sheet that is ranked and color-coded based off different categories here. So we have the time to kills of both close and long range, recoil control, mobility, which includes aim down, sight speed, sprint to fire, and overall movement speed kind of lumped into one category, damage per mag, bullet velocity, and then the reload time. So let's first kind of break down TTKs here. So close range time to kill up to about 25 or 30 meters. It's not super important for these guns. These are our long range guns where we're normally mostly concerned about the long range time to kill. But there are still plenty of times where you might be forced to use these up close, or especially in that kind of 20 to 30 meter awkward range, you might, be using this over your SMG. So it's still important to consider. Now, one thing I want to point out here is 10 means it's the best. So the Bas B has one of the best close range time to kills amongst these guns. Another one that is interesting is the MTZ Interceptor. The reason I have this as 5/10 is because if you hit one headshot, it gives it one of the best insanely good close range TTKs, a 3-shot kill. But if you don't, it's much slower. So that's why it's a 5/10 there. A lot of these are pretty similar overall, with the exception of the SVA 545. Overall, these are going to be within like less than a tenth of a second, and there's not any huge kind of like leaders here, and this again isn't as important. But when we get into the long range TTK, this is much more important. Overall, the MTZ 762 is one of the best, and that is because its damage range drop off doesn't occur till about 50 meters or so. So you get that same TTK all the way up to about 50 meters, and then even after that, it still has one of the better TTKs. So that's why it is so good up there. Eradicator is slightly not as good as MTZ, and then a lot of these other LMGs, the Pulemyot, the DG58, Bas B, Bruen, these are all very, very good and very, very similar. Now the SVA 545, then the burst mode is bad TTKs across the board, but the reason it is included in here as one of the best is it has literally zero recoil in that burst mode. And I'll just really quickly show you some of this charts, what I mean, so you can kind of like put numbers to names and stuff. So the MTZ 762, what I talked about, that TTK doesn't drop off till almost 60 meters, and that's why it is so incredibly good. And then with that MTZ Interceptor, you'll see on combination shot to kill, it is way above the rest, but if we switch to chest, it drops way back. And the other one to note is the DG58 LSW is also like that. It does require at least one headshot, but with a fully automatic gun, it is a lot easier to get that as well. And like I was saying, a lot of these guns are really, really close, so that's why they're all ranked like similarly around that like 8 or so. So when it comes to the low recoil guns, like I said, SVA 545, literally none. It is a burst though, so you have to toggle it into burst to get this like kind of better lower recoil mode. So it is a little bit harder to be accurate with it when you're constantly having to press your trigger. The MTZ Interceptor marksman rifle, that one, it resets every time you shoot the gun. It's a slow shooting marksman rifle, so that's why it essentially has no recoil either. Now when it comes to the fully automatic ones, I feel like the Pulemyot is probably the easiest to use by far. DG58 is also very, very close, but has a little bit more visual recoil to it. After that, Eradicator is very smooth shooting at first, but it's a weird gun that its fire rate actually changes after about 20 bullets. It slows down, and that recoil pattern kind of changes when it hits that mark, so it's a little bit hard to be consistent with that. Now guns like the Bas B, great TTKs, really bad recoil though. Ram 7 is another one though, great TTKs overall, but pretty tough recoil wise. And those guns that are kind of in these lower rankings for recoil tend to be a lot easier to use on resurgence maps, and can be kind of tough if you're a big map player trying to use these at super long range fights. Now the Bruen MK9, the actual recoil isn't that bad, but it does have a decent amount of visual recoil where that reticle is shaking, and that's why I have that ranked lower. If you are playing on controller, you probably might not notice this as much, but if you're a mouse and keyboard player, I would probably advise you stay away from a gun like the Bruen MK9 because of all that visual recoil it has. Now going on to mobility, and like I said, mobility includes aim down, sight speed, sprint to fire, and movement speed kind of all in one. And surprisingly, the Pulemyot 762 LMG, which is that big, huge LMG with the conversion kit, which is what the C stands for here, it actually has some insanely good mobility, and you can use it in mid-range situations, even on the smaller resurgence maps if needed. And that's one of the things I love about this gun. A lot of the other guns are pretty similar when it comes to this mobility area. The Ram 7, the SVA are a little bit better because they're assault rifles. Those other LMGs tend to struggle a little bit, but the reason the Pulemyot's so good is because of that conversion kit. You have to use a conversion kit. The gun's just not very good without it, essentially. Moving on to the damage per mag, the Pulemyot has that default 100 round mag. Even with the conversion kit, it is just insanely good, and you can easily take out out an entire team without having to reload. Now, the downside to that though is a much slower reload time. So you do have to be careful and you can get caught in some bad situations if you're not timing your reloads. Otherwise, after that, a lot of the other damage for mags are pretty similar. TAC Eradicator is a little bit better than some of the others, but the MTZ 762 is where it really struggles. That 30 round mag is the biggest it has. So outside of like duos, it can be a little bit tricky to use. I have played with it in trios and quads and done perfectly well, but you just have to be careful about not putting yourself in a situation where you need to really be trying to mow down an entire team by yourself. Bullet velocity is going to be very important at those much longer range fights. Probably not as important on like resurgence maps or at mid-range fights, but when you get beyond about 50 meters, this does definitely come into play. MTZ Interceptor with the right build can be crazy fast, and that's very important for that slow shooting marksman rifle. TAC Eradicator is also super good. Outside of that, a lot of these are really similar. The Ram 7 is a little bit slower of one, so but again with that recoil, it's a great resurgence gun, but probably not the best on big map. And then for reload, like I said earlier, they're all very similar with the exception of the Pulemyot just has that super like 8 or 9 second long reload time. All right, so we're just gonna fly through these loadouts here really quick. This is the Pulemyot. Of course, you do have to use that conversion kit, which is down here. If you don't know how to unlock this, once you get the gun max level, there will unlock like a challenge for it that it should tell you right here. They're usually pretty easy to get, but like I said, you definitely have to use that. Just as one time to kind of explain why I build the guns the way I do, the VT7 Spitfire suppressor is kind of your standard muzzle for all long range builds, and that is because it's going to add a lot of range and bullet velocity, which means that damage range drop off is going to be longer, the bullets are going to travel faster. It also helps our recoil control. So those are like the two main things that we want for a long range gun. Now the penalty is slower aim down sight and slower sprint to fire time, but for a long range gun, this stuff is more important. The standard underbarrel tends to be the Bruen heavy support grip, and there's two kind of options you have here. The Bruen heavy support grip is going to help a lot with horizontal recoil control. It's not listed here, but it's also going to help a lot with aiming idle sway in our firing aim stability, which is how much your reticle naturally sways back and forth when you're aiming the gun. And that is a very important underrated stat. Now, the other underbarrel to consider is the Kimura Rhine vertical grip. This one is going to help more when it comes to the vertical recoil. And in some guns, it's actually going to hurt your horizontal recoil. Me personally, I prefer to have horizontal recoil control, and I also like that extra aiming idle stability bonus. But for certain guns that kick hard vertically, we would use this instead. But for the Pulemyot, I like to use that one. Now, one other thing to note with the Pulemyot conversion kit is the optic is a little bit weird. And even if you use a zoom scope, you don't get that zoom effect. The 2.5 scope, like I'm using here, is the same as a 1x scope, just to throw that out there. And then usually we're going to put a barrel on that is going to be add our range and recoil control if we have that option, but we don't here for the Pulemyot. So moving on to the DG58 LSW LMG, you're going to see that the muzzle barrel are very similar here. I am using the Kimura underbarrel on this one to help more with vertical, but play around if you like that or the Bruen. Again, the Koryo EUI 2.5 is kind of your standard meta long range optic. It's a very nice one, but if you want to use a 1x, that's perfectly fine, or you could try a 3 or 4x if you prefer to do so. Now with the LMGs, because they have the default bigger mags, this has a 60 round mag, I don't need to use a magazine attachment. So we're going to go with the stock that helps our recoil control and just really maximize that recoil control, as that tends to be one of the most important things for a long range weapon. The only other options I would say is you could maybe take off the stock. You can put on a laser for faster ADS, or you can put on something like high velocity or high grain for more bullet velocity and range. Moving on to the TAC Eradicator. Again, basically identical build to that DG58 LSW. Definitely recommend the Kimura vertical grip because this one does kick vertically pretty hard. You absolutely can run a iron sight build as well. This one does have clean iron sights. I would say take the optic off and run a recoil control rear grip would be my #1 recommendation, or run a laser for faster ADS if you're like a resurgence player especially. Then we have the MTZ Interceptor marksman rifle. Now remember that this does take sniper ammo, so if you're playing in quads and you're just going crazy, you will run out of ammo, so you do have to kind of consider that when you're running this. But for this one, I normally like to prefer the higher bullet velocity, so that's why I'm using an ammunition attachment instead of like an underbarrel or stock for recoil control. You could also opt to go with maybe a higher zoom optic if you prefer, but generally this build is crazy good, especially on Urzikstan for like solos especially. If you want a super low recoil gun, SVA 545 is probably your best option. You do need to run it on the burst mode, so hitting over on your D-pad if you're a controller player to toggle it over that is the better option actually. We actually run the sonic suppressor on this one because we don't need the extra recoil control from the Spitfire because this gun literally has no recoil. The other attachments, we're actually running the Bruen heavy support more because of the aiming idle stability, not because of the recoil control. And same with the barrel. barrel. We're running the barrel because it's adding range and bullet velocity, not so much because it's adding recoil control, because you literally don't need recoil control attachments on this build. Ram 7 is one of my favorite ARs to run for Resurgence, and I am running an iron sight build for this one. That way we can max out our recoil control attachments. Another thing I will say is if this build still has too much recoil for you, you can take off the muzzle and put on an actual recoil compensator. I would probably go with like a horizontal recoil compensator, but just know you're going to ping on the minimap if you do that. Now, if you want to run an optic, I'd probably say take off the stock and then put on just like a 1x, or of course you could do a 2.5x optic. MTZ 762, which is probably one of the best solo guns in the game right now, is incredibly good. Again, very similar build as you're starting to see here. 30 round mag is as big as we got. If you're a controller player, I would say we go with the recoil control stock, but if you're a mouse and key, I would definitely say going with the Bruen Sport Heavy for that additional aiming idle stability, as that tends to be a little bit more important for mouse and keyboard players. And then the Bas B, it is still very, very good, mainly more on Resurgence as it struggles at long range with that recoil, but again, very similar build. I normally go 1x optic with this one because of that increased recoil, but feel free to run a 2.5 if you prefer to do that. And then the Bruen, the thing about the Bruen that makes it unique is you can put that 60 round mag on it, which makes it have a much faster reload time and better overall mobility compared to that big heavy LMG. Very, very good gun. Just some of that visual recoil, I feel like kind of kicks it out from being as good as the other ones, I would say, but still a great option. And then just as kind of like an added bonus, if you want an MW2 gun to run, the M13B is really, really good as just a low recoil, easy to use gun. I've used this a few times and really enjoyed this build a lot, actually. All right, guys, that is going to wrap things up. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please leave a like and maybe subscribe if you're new here. See you in the next one, guys.